If a man sent to end your life suddenly kneels before you, the real question isn't why he bowed, it's who you truly are. The voice behind me was calm, steady, and close enough that I could feel the faint warmth of someone standing just over my shoulder in the quiet concrete stillness of the parking garage. It was a little after 9 p.m., the kind of Chicago night when the city hum faded into a low, distant murmur and the air carried the cool bite of early fall. I had just locked my car and started walking toward the elevator when the voice appeared out of nowhere. Don't move. It wasn't loud, and it didn't need to be. The tone alone carried the kind of quiet authority that made people listen. I froze, not because I was afraid, but because I understood exactly what kind of moment this was. The garage lights hummed overhead, casting pale reflections across the polished concrete floor, and for a few seconds neither of us moved. Whoever stood behind me had chosen the perfect place. No traffic, no witnesses, just a quiet structure 2 blocks from my apartment where footsteps echoed and every sound traveled. Most people in that situation would panic. Most people would try to turn around too quickly or start asking questions they didn't really want answered. But I had learned a long time ago that the most important thing in moments like this was silence. So I stood there, hands relaxed at my sides, breathing slowly while the man behind me waited for a reaction that never came. The strange thing was, I already knew why he was there. In fact, I had expected something like this for weeks. When you spend enough time looking into powerful people who prefer to stay hidden, you eventually attract attention. And attention like that doesn't come from reporters or curious neighbors. It comes from professionals. I could hear the faint shift of leather shoes against concrete behind me as the man adjusted his stance. Whoever he was, he moved with the quiet precision of someone used to working unseen. Turn around slowly, he said. The words were simple, but there was a careful patience in the way he delivered them, as if he had given the same instruction many times before. I exhaled once, steady and calm, then turned. The man standing behind me looked exactly the way you might imagine someone in his line of work would look. Early 30s, dark jacket, steady eyes that missed nothing. But the moment his gaze landed on my face, something changed. The calm confidence in his posture faltered, just for a fraction of a second. His eyes narrowed slightly, studying me as if a memory had suddenly surfaced where it wasn't supposed to be. I watched the recognition travel across his expression slowly, the way a distant storm moves across a flat horizon. Then the impossible happened. The man who had arrived with quiet purpose, the man who clearly expected to control this moment, lowered his gaze. His shoulders stiffened, and without another word, he stepped back and dropped to one knee on the cold concrete floor. For a long second neither of us spoke. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The city rumbled somewhere far beyond the walls of the garage, and the man who had been sent to find me remained kneeling there like someone who had just seen a ghost from another life. The man remained on one knee, his head slightly lowered as if the weight of an old memory had suddenly pressed down on him. For a long moment, I simply studied him, letting the silence stretch between us while the low hum of fluorescent lights echoed through the empty structure. Up close, I could see details that confirmed what I had already suspected the moment I heard his voice. The way he balanced his weight evenly, the calm control in his breathing, the careful awareness of every corner of the garage without needing to turn his head. This was not a reckless man. This was someone trained to observe everything. And yet now he looked uncertain, as though the ground beneath him had shifted without warning. Stand up, I said quietly. My voice carried easily through the quiet space, steady and unhurried. The man hesitated for half a second before rising to his feet, though he did not meet my eyes immediately. Instead, he looked somewhere past my shoulder, as if still trying to confirm that the person standing in front of him was real. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. The quiet authority from moments earlier had been replaced with something closer to disbelief. Ethan Cole, he said slowly, almost like he was testing the name against his memory. Hearing my name from him did not surprise me. If someone had sent him, they would have given him that much. But the way he said it told me something different. He was not repeating information from a file. He was remembering. It has been a long time, Gabriel, I replied. That was when his eyes snapped back to mine. The recognition in them was unmistakable now, the same expression I had seen years ago in a completely different place under a completely different sky. The last time I had seen Gabriel Ortiz, he had been 24 years old, and standing on a training range in the Arizona desert with a group of recruits who believed they were preparing for ordinary government work. They had no idea how unusual their assignments would eventually become. I remembered the heat rising off the sand in slow waves that afternoon, the sound of distant helicopters crossing the horizon, and the determined focus Gabriel had shown every time he repeated a difficult exercise until he got it right. He had been one of the most disciplined trainees I had ever worked with. The kind of man who listened more than he spoke and paid attention to details other people ignored. Back then he had asked more questions than anyone else in the group, always searching for the reason behind every instruction. But that had been years ago, before several operations went wrong, before the organization that trained men like him began losing control of where some of those men eventually ended up. Gabriel looked older now, though not by much. The same sharp attention still lived in his eyes, but there was something else there too, something quieter and heavier that only appeared after someone had spent too much time working in shadows. He glanced down briefly, almost like he was considering the object still resting in his hand, then slowly lowered his arm and slipped it inside his jacket where it disappeared from sight. The gesture was careful and deliberate, a silent signal that whatever had brought him here had already changed. "They told me you were an analyst," Gabriel said finally, shaking his head slightly as if the words no longer made sense. "A quiet accountant living 2 blocks from the river." I allowed myself a small smile at that. People believe many things when the right paperwork supports. "The story," I said. Gabriel studied my face again, and this time there was no doubt left in his expression. "I should have recognized you sooner," he murmured. I shook my head once. "No," I replied calmly. "You recognized me exactly when you were supposed to." Gabriel remained still for a few seconds after I spoke, as if my words had unlocked a door in his memory that he had not opened in years. The quiet structure around us felt even larger now, every distant sound from the city above echoing faintly through the concrete levels. Somewhere far away a car door slammed and an engine started, but down here the air remained cool and still. Gabriel finally exhaled slowly and rubbed the back of his neck, the way people do when they suddenly realize a situation is very different from what they expected. "I studied your file for 3 days," he said carefully. "Every record, every detail. There was nothing in it that suggested any connection to the past." I nodded slightly because that part was true. The identity of Ethan Cole had been constructed to survive exactly that kind of scrutiny. The apartment lease, the tax records, the quiet accounting job near the Chicago River, all of it had been arranged to look painfully ordinary. To anyone checking the surface, the story made perfect sense. I looked toward the exit ramp of the garage where a faint strip of streetlight spilled across the floor, and then back at Gabriel. "If your file had shown anything unusual, you would have questioned the assignment before accepting it," I said calmly. Gabriel did not argue. Instead, he folded his arms loosely and leaned against the side of a nearby concrete pillar, his attention fully on me now. The tension that had filled the first moments of our encounter had changed into something quieter, more analytical. This was the same habit he had years ago during training, the ability to stop reacting emotionally and start examining the situation piece by piece. "So the question is not who you are," Gabriel said slowly. "The question is why someone wants you removed." His choice of words was deliberate, careful, avoiding anything dramatic. I appreciated that. It showed that some of the discipline from those years had not disappeared. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small folded receipt from the grocery store I had visited earlier that evening, then unfolded it briefly before slipping it back into my pocket. The simple motion was enough to draw his attention to the subtle camera mounted near the ceiling of the garage entrance. Gabriel noticed it immediately. His eyes moved once across the surrounding area, measuring angles and reflections the same way he used to measure targets on the training range. "You knew I would come here tonight," he said. "You chose a place with cameras and open lines of sight." I gave a faint shrug. "Preparation is simply a habit," I replied. The corner of Gabriel's mouth lifted slightly in something close to a smile, though it vanished quickly. "Some habits never change," he said quietly. For a moment neither of us spoke again. I could almost see the calculations happening behind his eyes as he mentally reviewed the information he had been given before arriving here. The story he had been told no longer matched the reality standing in front of him. Finally, he looked back at me and asked the question that mattered most. "Who hired me?" I did not answer immediately. Instead, I studied him the same way I had studied recruits years ago when deciding whether they were ready for assignments that demanded absolute clarity under pressure. Gabriel Ortiz had once been one of the most reliable people in that program. But time had a way of changing loyalties and priorities. A man named Richard Hale, I said at last. Gabriel's reaction was small, but unmistakable. His posture stiffened just enough to confirm that he knew the name. The senator, he said quietly. I nodded once. The same one. Gabriel looked toward the open ramp again, the faint glow of city lights reflecting in his eyes as the pieces began to align in his mind. If Hale sent me, he said slowly, then this was never about an accountant. I met his gaze calmly. No, I replied. It never was. Gabriel remained quiet after hearing the senator's name, his eyes fixed on the pale strip of light spilling down the ramp from the street above. For a man who had spent years making quick decisions, he now looked unusually thoughtful, as if he understood that whatever came next would not be simple. The faint rumble of traffic somewhere beyond the garage drifted down through the open entrance, but inside the structure everything remained calm and still. I could see the moment when Gabriel finished connecting the pieces in his mind. He turned his head slightly and looked back at me with the careful attention of someone reevaluating an entire mission from the beginning. If Richard Hale is involved, he said slowly, then there are only two possibilities. I waited without interrupting. Gabriel raised two fingers briefly as if counting them out. Either you discovered something he does not want anyone to know, he continued, or you are the one person who can prove it. I allowed myself a small nod. You always did learn quickly, I replied. The compliment was genuine. Years earlier, during those long days of instruction under the Arizona sun, Gabriel had been the recruit who absorbed patterns faster than anyone else. Some people learn procedures. Gabriel learned motives. That difference had made him valuable back then. It had probably kept him alive since. Gabriel pushed himself away from the concrete pillar and began walking slowly across the garage floor, not leaving the space, but moving just enough to think. His footsteps echoed softly with each step. The information I received described you as a quiet man who rarely left his office except to buy groceries or visit the same coffee shop 3 blocks away, he said. No connections to government agencies. No history worth mentioning. He stopped walking and looked back at me, which means every part of that description was designed to make someone like me underestimate you. I shrugged slightly. Sometimes the safest disguise is the most ordinary one. Gabriel considered that answer for a moment before glancing up toward the ceiling cameras again. The small lenses watched silently from their corners, recording nothing more dramatic than 2 men standing in a parking structure on a cool evening. You knew Hale might send someone, he said, but you did not know it would be me. No, I admitted calmly. That part surprised me. Gabriel exhaled slowly through his nose, a quiet breath that seemed to carry the weight of the past several years. When I accepted the assignment, he said, I thought it was routine. A name, a location, a schedule. I have done many jobs like that. He paused and looked directly at me again. But I have never accepted one that involved you. The faintest hint of humor crossed my expression. That is because the organization we once worked for never put us on opposite sides of a problem. Gabriel gave a short nod. No, he agreed. They did not. Another few seconds passed in silence while the reality of the situation settled fully between us. Finally, Gabriel spoke again, his voice quieter than before, but steady. If Hale wants you removed, then whatever you discovered must be significant. I reached into my coat pocket and removed a thin flash drive no larger than my thumb. The metal surface caught a bit of the overhead light as I held it up between us. Gabriel's attention focused on it immediately. Everything Senator Hale hopes will stay hidden is stored here, I said. Gabriel stared at the small device, then back at me. And you are walking around Chicago with that in your pocket, he said in disbelief. I slipped the drive back into my coat. For now, I answered calmly. Gabriel let out a quiet breath that sounded almost like a laugh. You have not changed at all, he said. Still calm in the middle of situations that would make most people nervous. I met his gaze evenly. That is because I expected the situation to arrive sooner or later. Gabriel folded his arms again and studied me carefully. And now that it has arrived, he asked, what do you plan to do next? Gabriel's question lingered in the quiet air of the garage for several seconds after he asked it. What do you plan to do next? The words were simple, but the weight behind them was not. I leaned slightly against the side of my car and looked toward the open ramp again where the distant glow of Chicago's streetlights stretched across the concrete floor. The city above us was still alive with late evening movement, taxis passing intersections, people walking along the river walk, office lights slowly turning off one window at a time. Down here, however, everything felt removed from that ordinary world. It always surprised people how calm a place like this could feel even when important decisions were being made. What I plan to do, I said finally, is exactly what I have been doing for the past 4 months. Gabriel studied my expression carefully. Waiting, he said. I gave a small nod. Preparing, I corrected. Gabriel folded his arms again and tilted his head slightly as if reviewing everything he had seen tonight. You knew Hale would eventually realize you were looking into him, he said. Which means you expected someone to be sent. I nodded again. Yes. But you stayed in the same apartment, kept the same job, walked the same streets every day. I let out a quiet breath. Because changing patterns too early raises suspicion, I explained. Sometimes the safest way to avoid attention is to behave exactly the way people expect. Gabriel considered that for a moment before letting out a faint laugh that echoed softly against the concrete walls. That sounds exactly like something you said during training, he murmured. Lesson 3, Day 1, I replied calmly. Never rush a situation that benefits from patience. The memory seemed to settle over both of us for a moment. I could still picture the long wooden tables in the briefing room in Arizona where recruits like Gabriel had spent hours studying scenarios that forced them to think several steps ahead. Back then those lessons had been theoretical exercises. Now they were simply habits. Gabriel's gaze shifted toward my coat pocket where the flash drive rested unseen. And that information, he said quietly. You believe it is enough to expose Hale? I did not answer immediately. Instead I looked directly at him and asked a question of my own. How long have you been working independently? Gabriel's expression tightened slightly at the unexpected change of subject. 6 years, he said after a moment. Long enough to recognize when someone powerful is trying to erase a problem. I nodded slowly. Then you already know the answer. Gabriel looked down at the floor briefly and shook his head. If Hale believes that device contains proof of something serious, he said, he will not stop with one attempt. I know, I replied, and neither will the people who eventually learn the truth. Gabriel's eyes returned to mine again, this time with a different kind of focus. You are not planning to release the information immediately, he said. It was not a question. I allowed a faint smile. You always understood timing better than most people. Gabriel let out a quiet breath and walked a few steps closer, lowering his voice even though we were alone in the structure. Then this entire situation tonight, he said carefully, was not an accident. I met his gaze calmly. No, I answered. It was an introduction. Gabriel remained silent for a long second before asking the question that truly mattered. An introduction to what? I slipped my hands into my coat pockets and looked toward the ramp where the glow of city lights continued to spill across the garage floor. To the moment, I said quietly, when you decide which side of the truth you want to stand on. Gabriel did not respond immediately after I spoke. The words hung in the quiet air of the garage, heavy with the kind of meaning that only appears when someone realizes the decision in front of them cannot be avoided forever. He shifted his weight slightly and looked toward the open ramp again, where the faint glow of Chicago's skyline shimmered against the polished concrete floor. For several seconds, he said nothing, and that silence told me more than any quick answer could have. Gabriel had always been careful with choices. Even years ago during training, when most recruits reacted quickly just to prove confidence, he was the one who paused long enough to think about consequences. Finally, he turned back toward me, his expression thoughtful but steady. You always did this, he said quietly. You never forced people into decisions. You just made them realize the decision was already there. I allowed a small nod. People choose more carefully when they believe the choice belongs to them. Gabriel let out a faint breath that sounded almost like a tired laugh. And you are certain Hale will not stop, he said. It was not exactly a question, but I answered it anyway. No one with that much power ever stops once they believe something threatens them. Gabriel walked slowly toward the center of the garage again, his footsteps echoing softly with each step. He looked up at the security camera mounted above the elevator entrance, and then back at me. If I walk away tonight, he said, Someone else will be sent. Yes, I replied calmly. Probably more than one. Gabriel nodded slightly, as if that possibility had already crossed his mind. And if I return to Hale and tell him the assignment is complete, he continued slowly, he will eventually discover the truth. Eventually, I agreed. Gabriel rubbed his chin thoughtfully and looked down at the concrete floor for a moment before lifting his gaze again. You are asking me to stand against a man who has influence across half the political committees in Washington. I shrugged lightly. I am not asking you to do anything. Gabriel gave me a long look that suggested he understood the difference between the words and the reality behind them. You always were careful with language, he said. You taught us that the wrong sentence could change an entire operation. Words shape perception, I replied quietly. And perception shapes action. Gabriel walked back toward me again, stopping a few feet away. The calm confidence that had returned to his posture told me he had already reached the point where hesitation faded. You mentioned earlier that tonight was an introduction, he said. An introduction to the moment when I choose which side of the truth I stand on. I nodded once. Gabriel studied my face carefully, as if searching for any sign of uncertainty, but he found none. After another brief pause, he finally spoke again. Then I suppose the real question is whether you believe I still remember the lessons you taught us. I met his gaze steadily. I would not have shown you that flash drive if I thought you had forgotten. Gabriel's eyes flickered briefly toward my coat pocket where the small device remained hidden, then back to my face. The faint smile that appeared this time stayed a little longer. You always trusted your instincts, he said quietly. Sometimes that was the only reason any of us made it through those training exercises. I tilted my head slightly. And did those instincts ever lead you in the wrong direction? Gabriel thought about that for a moment before answering. No, he admitted. The garage fell silent again for several seconds as the distant sound of a passing train drifted faintly through the city above. Finally, Gabriel took a slow breath and straightened his shoulders. When he spoke again, his voice carried the calm certainty of someone who had finally finished weighing every possibility. Then I believe it is time for me to remember exactly who trained me. Gabriel's words settled into the quiet air like the final piece of a long, unfinished conversation. The distant rumble of the city above continued as it always did, unaware that two men standing in a concrete garage were quietly deciding the direction of events that could eventually ripple far beyond Chicago. I watched Gabriel carefully as he spoke, not because I doubted him, but because habits formed during years of training never truly disappear. A person reveals more through small movements than through confident sentences. The way he straightened his shoulders, the way his eyes moved once across the surrounding structure, measuring distances, exits, and angles. Gabriel Ortiz had made his choice. Then we should start with the obvious question, Gabriel said after a moment. If Senator Hale believes you are dangerous enough to send someone like me, how long before he realizes something has gone wrong tonight? I considered that briefly before answering. He will begin wondering the moment you fail to report back. Gabriel nodded slightly. And when that happens, he will assume the assignment was interrupted. Most likely, I agreed. Gabriel glanced toward the ramp again, where the glow of traffic lights from the street above reflected faintly along the concrete walls. Then the smartest move would be to give him the report he expects. I tilted my head slightly. You intend to tell him the assignment was completed. Gabriel looked back at me calmly. That is the fastest way to slow down his curiosity. The idea was sound. For several seconds I said nothing, letting him explain the rest of the reasoning himself. Gabriel noticed the pause and continued. If Hale believes the problem has been solved, he will move on to other priorities. He will stop asking questions. And that gives us time. I finished quietly. Gabriel nodded. Exactly. I stepped away from the car and walked a few feet toward the center of the garage, glancing once toward the cameras that watched silently from the ceiling. Time can be more valuable than information, I said. Gabriel gave a small smile at that. Another lesson from Arizona, he replied. The memory lingered briefly between us again. The long desert afternoons when recruits learned that patience often decided outcomes long before action ever began. Gabriel looked toward the ramp once more and then back to me. But there is a complication, he said. I waited. Hale did not contact me directly. Gabriel continued. Someone inside his network arranged the assignment. A man named Curtis Bell. The name sounded familiar. I searched my memory for a moment before the connection appeared. Bell works as a legal advisor for Hale's campaign committee, I said slowly. Gabriel nodded. That is the public version of his job. I understood immediately. Public titles rarely describe the full role someone played when powerful people wanted sensitive tasks handled quietly. Gabriel folded his arms again. If Bell expects confirmation tonight, I can provide it, he said. But after that he will eventually want proof. I looked toward the ramp where the faint headlights of a passing car briefly illuminated the lower level before disappearing again. Proof can take many forms, I replied. Gabriel studied me for a moment, and then gave a small nod as if he understood exactly what I meant. You already anticipated that step as well. I did not answer directly. Instead, I reached into my coat pocket again and removed the small flash drive, turning it slowly between my fingers so the metal caught the pale overhead light. Gabriel watched it carefully. Everything Hale wants hidden is inside that device, he said quietly. I nodded once. Gabriel looked back at me, the calm certainty returning fully to his expression. Then our next move is simple, he said. We make Senator Hale believe his problem has disappeared. I slipped the flash drive back into my pocket and met his gaze steadily. And while he believes that, I said, we prepare for the moment when the truth can no longer be ignored. Gabriel's plan settled into the quiet space between us with the steady logic of a chess move that had been waiting several turns to happen. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The distant glow of streetlights continued to spill down the ramp, while the soft mechanical buzz of the overhead lights echoed faintly through the empty structure. Somewhere above us, a car rolled across the upper level, its tires whispering briefly against the concrete before the sound faded again. Gabriel finally reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small phone. The screen illuminated his face for a moment with pale blue light. He studied it quietly before speaking. Curtis Bell expects a message within the hour, he said. He is careful about communication. He never asks questions directly, but he expects confirmation when something is finished. I nodded slightly. Then you should give him exactly what he expects. Gabriel glanced at me once before typing a short message on the screen. His movements were calm and practiced, the same steady focus he used years ago when learning to control every small detail during field exercises. After a few seconds, he stopped typing and looked up again. Once I send this, he said slowly, the story becomes official. In their world, the problem will be considered solved. And that is exactly the story we want them to believe, I replied. Gabriel gave a short nod and pressed the screen once. The message disappeared from the display as it was sent. For several seconds, the phone remained silent in his hand while he waited. I knew that feeling well. Waiting for confirmation often revealed more about a system than the message itself. Finally, the screen vibrated once with a soft tone. Gabriel glanced down and read the reply. His expression remained neutral, but the slight shift in his posture told me everything I needed to know. Bell responded quickly, he said. He says the senator appreciates efficiency. I allowed a faint smile at that. Powerful people always appreciate efficiency when they believe it protects them. Gabriel slipped the phone back into his jacket and leaned lightly against the pillar again. The tension that had filled the garage earlier had changed into something quieter now, a shared understanding that the first move had already been made. There is something else you should know, Gabriel said after a moment. I looked at him. Bell mentioned that the senator will be traveling tomorrow afternoon, he continued. Washington to Chicago. A private fundraising event near the river. The information settled into place immediately. He wants to appear confident, I said quietly. Someone who believes a threat has been removed does not hide from public appearances. Gabriel nodded slowly, which means he believes the message I sent. I walked a few steps toward the ramp and looked out toward the distant skyline where the lights of downtown reflected faintly in the dark surface of the river. Chicago at night had always felt calm to me, even when complicated events moved quietly beneath that calm surface. After a few seconds, I turned back toward Gabriel. If Hale is coming here tomorrow, I said, then that is when everything changes. Gabriel studied my face carefully. You already have a plan for that moment. It was not a question. I gave a small nod. The truth inside that flash drive is not meant to stay hidden forever, I replied. Gabriel folded his arms again and looked toward the city lights. Beyond the ramp. Then tomorrow, he said quietly, the senator will walk into Chicago believing his problem disappeared tonight. I met his gaze calmly. Yes, I answered. and that belief will make him far less careful than he should be. The quiet certainty in Gabriel's voice lingered in the garage after he spoke about the senator's arrival the next afternoon. The city lights outside the ramp flickered faintly across the polished concrete floor, while the hum of the overhead lights continued their steady rhythm above us. I remained near the edge of the ramp for a moment, looking out toward the skyline where the river cut through downtown like a ribbon of dark glass between towers of light. Chicago had always been a city where powerful people preferred to appear confident in public. Fundraising dinners, quiet meetings in private rooms, polite conversations between people who believed influence could solve any problem. Senator Richard Hale understood that world well. What he did not understand was that confidence built on incomplete information could be dangerous. I turned back toward Gabriel and studied him carefully. "Tell me about the event," I said calmly. Gabriel thought for a moment before answering. "A private reception at a hotel ballroom near the river," he explained. "Political donors, campaign advisors, a few business leaders who like to appear close to power. The kind of event where cameras are allowed, but only the right cameras." I nodded slowly. That type of gathering always followed the same pattern. Public enough to appear transparent, controlled enough to protect anything truly important. "And Hale will believe he can walk into that room tomorrow without concern," I said quietly. Gabriel nodded. "He believes the problem was resolved tonight." I gave a faint smile at that. "Then he will be relaxed." Gabriel crossed his arms and leaned lightly against the pillar again. "Relaxed people overlook details," he said. "Exactly," I replied. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. The faint glow from the street outside shifted slightly as a passing car moved through the intersection above. Finally, Gabriel pushed himself away from the pillar and stepped closer. "You said earlier that the information on that flash drive was not meant to stay hidden forever," he said. "I assume tomorrow is when you intend to reveal it." I shook my head slightly. "Not reveal," I corrected. "Introduce." Gabriel watched my face carefully. "There is a difference." "A very important one," I replied. I reached into my coat pocket again and removed the flash drive, holding it up briefly between us before slipping it back into place. "Information like this must appear at the right moment," I continued calmly. "Too early, and it is dismissed as rumor. Too late, and the damage is already done." Gabriel considered that for a moment. "So tomorrow is not about exposing Hale completely," he said slowly. "Tomorrow is about placing the truth where it cannot be ignored." I gave a small nod. "Exactly." Gabriel looked toward the ramp again, where the city lights reflected faintly along the walls. "Then we will need to be there before he arrives." "Yes," I said, "and we will need to watch carefully." Gabriel's eyes narrowed slightly with curiosity. "Watch for what?" I allowed a faint smile. "For the moment when a man who believes he is completely safe suddenly realizes the world around him is not what he expected." Gabriel exhaled slowly and shook his head once in quiet disbelief. "You have already mapped the entire situation in your mind," he said. "Not the entire situation," I replied calmly. "Only the first step." Gabriel looked back at me, his expression thoughtful again. "And after that step?" I slipped my hands into my coat pockets and glanced once more toward the glowing skyline beyond the ramp. "After that," I said quietly, "the truth will begin to move on its own." For several seconds after I spoke, neither of us moved. The quiet of the garage seemed to grow deeper, as if the entire structure had decided to hold its breath along with us. Gabriel stood a few feet away with his arms loosely folded, his eyes fixed on the open ramp where the glow of the Chicago skyline shimmered against the polished concrete. Far above us, a car passed across the street, its headlights briefly casting moving shadows along the walls before disappearing again. "You always said that the first move is rarely the one that wins the game," Gabriel said quietly. I looked back at him and allowed a small nod. "Because the first move only reveals who is paying attention," I replied. Gabriel's mouth curved into the faintest hint of a smile, the kind that appears when someone remembers an old lesson that once sounded theoretical but now makes perfect sense. "Then tomorrow is when we find out who is paying attention," he said. I stepped away from the ramp and walked slowly back toward the center of the garage where my car waited under the dim lights. The concrete floor carried the soft echo of each step, a steady rhythm that matched the calm pace of my thoughts. "Tomorrow," I said, "is when we learn how confident Senator Hale truly feels." Gabriel watched me carefully. You believe he will arrive without much protection, he said. I opened the car door briefly and reached inside to retrieve a thin folder from the passenger seat. After closing the door again, I held the folder out so Gabriel could see it. Men like Hale rarely appear without protection, I replied. But protection designed for public appearances is very different from protection designed for real danger. Gabriel glanced at the folder and then back at me. What is inside? I opened the folder slowly and turned it so the overhead lights illuminated the pages within. There were photographs, copies of financial records, travel itineraries, and several printed messages exchanged between people who believed their conversations would never be seen by anyone outside their circle. Gabriel studied the documents carefully for several seconds before looking back at me. You have been building this case for longer than 4 months, he said quietly. I closed the folder and slipped it back under my arm. Closer to a year, I admitted. Gabriel exhaled slowly through his nose. And all that time Hale believed you were just another quiet accountant walking to the same coffee shop every morning. Appearances can be convincing, I said. Gabriel nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of the information. Then tomorrow's event is not simply a fundraiser, he said. It is the stage you have been preparing. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I looked toward the ramp again, where the distant city lights continued their steady glow against the night sky. Finally, I spoke. Tomorrow the senator will step into a room full of people who believe they understand power, I said calmly. Gabriel tilted his head slightly. And you intend to show them something different. I met his gaze. I intend to let the truth appear in front of them. Gabriel remained quiet for a moment, then gave a slow nod as if he understood exactly how carefully that moment would have to unfold. And once it appears, he said softly, it will be impossible to push it back into the shadows. I slipped the folder under my coat and looked toward the exit ramp where the city waited beyond the concrete walls. Exactly, I replied. And tomorrow Senator Hale will finally discover that some problems do not disappear simply because someone tells him they have. The quiet weight of the folder under my coat remained between us as the low hum of the garage lights continued overhead. For a moment Gabriel did not speak. He simply looked toward the ramp again, watching the faint glow of Chicago's night traffic sliding across the concrete walls. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the calm focus of someone who had moved past uncertainty and into planning. Tomorrow the senator will walk into that ballroom believing he controls the room, he said slowly. I nodded once. That is how men like him survive in that world, I replied. They believe every conversation, every handshake, every smile in the room exists because of them. Gabriel pushed himself away from the pillar and stepped closer to the car, studying the structure of the garage one last time as if committing the entire space to memory. Old habits rarely faded. If the truth appears in that room, he said, it will spread faster than he can contain it. I gave a faint smile. That is the idea. Gabriel's expression grew thoughtful again. But timing will matter, he continued. If the information surfaces too suddenly, it could be dismissed as a political stunt. I nodded slowly because he was right. That is why tomorrow is not about accusations, I said quietly. It is about questions. Gabriel looked back at me. Questions. I leaned lightly against the side of the car and looked toward the ramp where the skyline shimmered beyond the concrete walls. When the right question appears in the right room, I said, powerful people often reveal more than they intend. Gabriel considered that for a moment, then let out a small breath of understanding. You are not planning to confront him directly, he said. No, I replied. Someone else will ask the first question. Gabriel raised an eyebrow slightly. Someone you trust. I allowed a small nod. Someone who has been waiting for the same truth to surface. Gabriel folded his arms again, his gaze narrowing, slightly as the pieces aligned in his mind. A journalist, he said. I did not answer immediately, but the faint smile that crossed my face was enough confirmation. Gabriel shook his head once in quiet admiration. You planned this long before tonight, he said. Long before Hale decided to remove the problem. Preparation is rarely wasted, I replied calmly. For a few seconds we stood in silence again while the distant city continued its steady rhythm above us. Finally Gabriel spoke once more. If the journalist asks the right question, he said slowly, and if the senator answers without realizing what he is revealing, I finished the thought quietly, then the truth will begin to move on its own. Gabriel nodded slowly. And once the truth begins moving, he said, even powerful men have trouble stopping it. I closed the folder under my coat and looked toward the exit ramp again. The glow of the skyline seemed brighter now, reflecting faintly against the smooth floor of the garage. Tomorrow the senator will stand in front of donors, cameras, and reporters, I said calmly. Gabriel watched me carefully, and he will believe he is completely safe. I met his gaze with quiet certainty. That belief, I said softly, will be his greatest mistake. The garage remained quiet for several seconds after I spoke about the senator's mistake. The hum of the overhead lights seemed louder now, echoing softly through the empty structure while the distant pulse of the city continued above us. Gabriel stood with his arms loosely folded, watching the ramp where the glow of Chicago's skyline reflected faintly along the polished floor. Finally, he exhaled slowly and shook his head once. I used to think the most dangerous situations involved weapons or sudden confrontations, he said quietly. But this feels different. I looked at him with mild curiosity. Different how? Gabriel glanced back toward me. Because tomorrow will not involve force, he replied. It will involve attention. The moment the right people begin paying attention, the situation will change faster than anyone expects. I gave a small nod because he understood exactly what made moments like that powerful. Truth did not need dramatic entrances. Sometimes it only needed the right audience. Gabriel walked slowly toward the ramp and looked out toward the city again. So tomorrow the senator arrives confident, he said. He shakes hands, greets donors, answers polite questions from reporters. I leaned lightly against the car and watched him think through the scene step by step. And then someone asks the question he never expected to hear. Gabriel turned his head slightly. The journalist. I nodded. Yes. Gabriel remained quiet for a moment before speaking again. When that question appears, Hale will not realize what is happening immediately. No, I replied. Because powerful people often assume they control the conversation. Gabriel gave a faint smile at that. Which means he will answer the question the way he always answers questions. Confidently, I said. Exactly, Gabriel replied. He stepped away from the ramp and walked back toward me, the soft echo of his shoes marking each step. And the moment he answers, the truth begins moving. I nodded slowly. Because every camera in that room will record his reaction. Gabriel's expression grew thoughtful again. And once journalists start comparing his answers with the information inside that flash drive, he continued, the story will grow larger than he can manage. I slipped my hands into my coat pockets and looked toward the exit ramp again, where the skyline shimmered quietly beyond the concrete walls. Truth rarely moves fast at the beginning, I said calmly. But once enough people see it clearly, it becomes impossible to stop. Gabriel studied my face carefully. You knew all of this long before tonight. I hoped the moment would come, I replied. Preparation only matters if the opportunity eventually appears. Gabriel gave a slow nod. And tonight, he said quietly, that opportunity arrived. For a moment we both looked toward the city lights beyond the ramp, the same skyline that tomorrow would host a gathering where one man believed his reputation remained secure. Finally Gabriel spoke again. What happens after tomorrow? I considered the question briefly before answering. After tomorrow the truth will begin reaching people who were never meant to see it. Gabriel folded his arms again, his posture calm and steady now. Which means the senator's world becomes very complicated. I allowed a faint smile. Yes. Gabriel looked toward the skyline once more before speaking his final thought. And the strange part, he said quietly, is that he will never realize the moment everything changed began in a quiet parking garage with two men standing under fluorescent lights. The garage slowly returned to its ordinary silence after Gabriel spoke those words about. The moment everything had begun. For a long second neither of us moved. The soft hum of the fluorescent lights above us continued its steady rhythm, while the glow of Chicago's skyline shimmered beyond the ramp, like a quiet reminder that the city never truly slept. I looked out toward those distant towers and thought about how many conversations were happening at that very moment in offices, restaurants, and hotel suites across the city. Deals being discussed, alliances forming, promises being made between people who believed they understood how power worked. Tomorrow night, many of those same people would gather in a ballroom beside the river, dressed in tailored suits and evening dresses, confident that they were witnessing another ordinary political event. Senator Richard Hale would step onto that stage with the calm smile he had practiced for years, shaking hands, thanking donors, answering polite questions from reporters who were expected to follow a familiar script. In his mind, the problem that once threatened him had already disappeared somewhere in the shadows of Chicago. Gabriel stepped beside me near the ramp and looked out at the skyline as well. For the first time since we had met in that garage, his expression carried something lighter, not relief exactly, but clarity. He will never know how close he came to understanding the truth tonight, Gabriel said quietly. I allowed a faint smile. Sometimes the truth waits patiently for the right moment, I replied. Gabriel nodded slowly. And tomorrow that moment arrives. We stood there for another few seconds while the distant headlights of passing cars moved across the streets above like slow-flowing streams of light. Finally, Gabriel turned toward the exit ramp and adjusted his jacket. The calm certainty in his posture told me he had fully accepted the path ahead. I will contact you in the morning, he said. Once I confirm the senator has arrived. I nodded once. Be careful, I replied. Gabriel paused briefly before walking toward the ramp. You taught us to be careful, he said without turning back. His footsteps faded gradually as he disappeared into the dim light beyond the concrete walls, leaving the garage quiet once more. I remained beside the car for a moment longer, looking out at the skyline where the river reflected the lights of the city like scattered stars across dark water. Tomorrow the ballroom near that river would be filled with voices, cameras, and carefully rehearsed speeches. Senator Hale would stand beneath bright chandeliers believing the room belonged to him. But somewhere in that crowd a single question would rise at exactly the right moment, and the answer he gave would begin a chain of events that could not be reversed. I slipped the folder more securely beneath my coat and walked toward the driver's door of the car. The engine started with a quiet hum, echoing softly through the empty structure. As I guided the car slowly toward the ramp, the skyline of Chicago opened before me, bright and calm against the night sky. Powerful men often believed they controlled every outcome because they controlled every conversation. Tomorrow one conversation would prove otherwise. And by the time the city lights reflected across the river again that night, Senator Richard Hale would finally understand something he had never considered before. Some truths cannot be buried. Some questions cannot be silenced. And sometimes the quietest moments beneath fluorescent lights are the ones that change everything.